In this lecture, we will conclude our look at American archaeology by focusing on the methods and the theory behind the methods that archaeologists are using to collect the data that they study in the lab and that they ultimately share with their audience. We have to begin by asking why archaeologists survey or study an archaeological feature, again, a non-portable artifact such as a grave, or an archaeological site. In this case, we consider an archaeological site to be any sort of geographical clustering of archaeological data. Now, archaeological data in this case, as you already know, is comprised of artifacts, things like ecofacts, features, or any combination of these kinds of data resources. The next question that we have to pose is, how are we going to actually acquire this research data, or how are we going to get the artifacts or the elements of a feature or the qualities of a site out of the archaeological record? Let's take a moment to review what data is, because as Louis Binford pointed out, and as we discussed in our last lecture, archaeologists are social scientists. So the scientific method is very important to how we accomplish our goals. With that said, let's visit data for a moment. Data, in this case, is the raw material of science. They are the measurable observations that form the basis for our hypotheses, our theories, and ultimately our understandings. In modern archaeological circles, we attempt to understand how the archaeological record and all of its data resources formed. We ask questions having to do with the human activity or activities that led to the deposition of artifacts. And we ask, what happened after the deposits were initially formed? In order to do this, we have to approach the archaeological record, or the history of human occupation on the planet, systematically. In order to accomplish this task, we have to think about our bottom line. We have to design a project that will efficiently elucidate the kind of data that we are trying to analyze, or that we are ultimately looking for as we test our hypotheses. One of the primary questions that we have to ask ourselves is, how are we going to plan and implement this research project? The answer to all of these questions lies in our scientific method. This means that we, in a very systematic way, sample the archaeological record. We attempt to be predictable not only in the manner with which we sample the record, but how we test it as well. And we have to utilize a tried and true manner of analysis or field research. Many of the systematic techniques that we use to study the archaeological record are drawn from the work of early American archaeologists such as Maxwell Ewell or Alfred Kidder. We also recognize even earlier contributions by William Henry Holmes and John Wesley Powell. The contributions that these early archaeologists have made to the discipline can be seen in the three concepts that I would like to cover with you in this slide in terms of our survey strategies, or the strategies that we utilize today to analyze or more closely understand the archaeological record. The first is surface survey. Sometimes referred to as pedestrian field testing, surface survey is an archaeological survey technique which uses direct observation to discover and gather archaeological data that may be present on the ground surface. This tells us what may be happening at deeper levels. Often, students of archaeology will map out this artifact scatter and will ultimately collect and analyze this material in hopes of planning more efficiently the more invasive archaeological techniques which follow. Shovel testing, which I have listed here on the slide as well for you, is a kind of subsurface archaeological survey technique. Shovel tests are usually about 1 meter in overall depth and roughly 50 centimeters in overall diameter. If you take a look at the image that accompanies this slide, you can see one of our students utilizing a shovel test pit in order to understand what might be going on in the local subsurface. It helps us to plan eventually how we might more invasively understand the archaeological record. Once we have a better understanding of what is or isn't present in the subsurface environment of a given location, we establish more invasive techniques, larger test units, and the more common test units generally are 1 by 1 or 2 by 2 meter test pits. These larger test units will then be organized according to a much larger research grid. In the next few slides, we'll go through this process of establishing a research grid based upon the discovery of a subsurface feature. Here's the first of a series of slides to help better understand this process. What we're looking at here is the presence of a hypothetical feature, something that looks or appears to be a square-like feature, maybe a house foundation of a prehistoric or historic nature. The circles that you see at regular intervals represent these shovel test pits that I discussed just a minute ago. Those particular test pits that are filled in represent a site or a test unit where the student of archaeology has recovered something of significance, something that could be considered to be an artifact. In this case, an artifact associated with a subsurface feature. Please note that the student putting in these test pits is unaware of the feature that you see imposed below what will eventually become our research grid. What you will note here is that when a shovel test pit provides a student of archaeology with some sort of artifactual material, the grid or the space between these test units will be tightened. When additional discoveries are made, that tightening process continues. Let's look at the next slide. Note what has changed. As we begin to tighten the spaces between shovel test pits, more discoveries are made. And as these discoveries are made, a greater understanding of the extent of this subsurface feature is understood. This process continues until the extent of a feature is established. Once this extent is understood, a research grid is superimposed over the feature, and a more close examination of the feature then will continue. In this case, we will see larger test units being implemented and a larger portion of the feature actually being exposed. Once we have established our research grid, we have additional questions that we have to start asking ourselves there in the field. One of the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, to understand the feature, to understand the site, how much of the grid has to be excavated? We ask ourselves whether or not we have enough public backing in order to support this kind of research. And after all this consideration is complete, we have to turn around and ask ourselves something about the grid itself. Are we orientating the grid in such a way as to elucidate the most information with the least amount of work and the smallest sample size? An archaeological grid lies at the heart of archaeological research. As we establish these research grids, we have specific landmarks that we have to consider, the most important being datum. The term datum is associated with that data point, which is a 0 point in our understanding of the vertical and horizontal nature of everything going on within the grid. Once we establish datum, then we utilize the cardinal directions, magnetic north for example, in order to organize all test units in relation to that point. No matter what the scale is, this research grid is subdivided into increasingly smaller and smaller units. It allows us to be systematically precise as we reconstruct not only the artifacts and the features and the sites that we study, but also as we reconstruct the communities which left these evidences behind for us to analyze. At this point, we begin to open up our perspective with regards to the kinds of technologies that we can use to better understand and more efficiently understand the subsurface nature of a location of interest. One of the more traditional methods that archaeologists use, even before they begin their shovel test pit process, is to engage aerial photographs. For this class, we recognize two main types of aerial photographs that are utilized by archaeologists. The first type, pictured on the left of this screen, is referred to as a vertical aerial photograph. This is the more common that is used by archaeologists in the field. This shows features and sites in a plan view. It allows for direct measurements once the scale is established on the photograph to be employed for mapping. It also helps us as we prepare our grid and the overall amount of work and money that will be required to adequately cover that amount of space, in this case the amount of space that we consider to be important giving our initial tests. The second type that you'll see on the right of the screen is referred to as an oblique type. This is very uncommon when it comes to the work of archaeologists. However, it does show features and sites as a visual whole. It situates surface features, for example, on a already established modern landscape. Vertical and oblique photographs, as you can imagine, with the rapid change that has occurred in our technologies since the 1960s, can take on many forms. In the next few slides, we'll look at some of these applications. Here is a very good example of a black and white vertical photograph that is employed by archaeologists attempting to understand the urban plan of the Pueblo environment. From the Four Corners region, this photograph from Chama Canyon gives us a really good understanding of what we can learn by just closely examining this photograph. Let's look at scale first. Along the base of the photograph, you will recognize a single lane road. This provides archaeologists and the public with access to the site. This will give you a sense of scale. Once that scale is established, you can take a look at the orientation of the now disintegrated Pueblo walls. You can start to point out areas of occupation and areas of public or religious use. Take a moment to look for a circular feature, which is very challenging to make out, but it exists in the largest rectangular expression or spatial expression within the site. This circular disturbance is what is left of a large kiva. Here's another view of the Chama Canyon site. To the right, we see really how challenging it is when you're on the ground to see the kinds of patterns which emerge in these aerial photographs. To the left, we see this rather unique image. It's a false color image, which helps us to better understand the footpaths and their orientation in relation to the site. Once we've gone through the process of better understanding a site or a subsurface feature, we then have to ask ourselves some additional questions, and we have to sample efficiently. So how does this occur? During the sampling process, it's important that we understand something about our research boundaries. How far can we extend our research grid in order to best understand the archaeological record in the location we are studying it? Some of these boundaries may be natural. These could be ecological zones or landforms which are part of the local landscape. Some of them could be cultural boundaries, things like previous findings of artifacts or features, or modern roads. The last series of boundaries can be systematic in nature. These are boundaries that we set for ourselves based upon our own limitations and ultimately what we are testing. Once the boundaries are set, there are a series of up to 4 sampling techniques that we can use as we establish our research grid. Over the next series of slides, we will take a look at each of these in another hypothetical situation. They fall into a random, a stratified random, a systematic, and a stratified systematic sampling strategy. In relation to the kind of strategy or sampling strategy that we are employing, we also have to consider the size of our samples. Our sample sizes, those elements of the grid that we are directly testing through archaeological means, will relate very closely to the heterogeneity of the overall region, the potential size of features or sites, the degree of accuracy which we are willing to accept, and the amount of time and money that we have available to us to do our research. Let's take a moment to look at all four of these sampling strategies in relation to the concerns that I just mentioned. Here, as you note, we have a hypothetical environment, an environment composed of heavily forested areas, open grassland, and a marshy environment. There's also evidence of significant erosion in this hypothetical example. We have 3 research grids, and we establish meter by meter test units randomly within each of these grids. Take a look at some of our hits and misses. Clearly a miss would be an area that is fully eroded, somewhere where the archaeological record is gone due to water or wind action. Another area that would be considered a miss is an area like a marshland, where we're unable to physically test the ground because of too much soil moisture. Now compare this to a stratified random sample. What this means is we take each of the research grids, we assess the environments that these research grids are being set into, and then based upon that we create areas within them, that we stratify within that grid areas of specific importance or areas where we definitely can test. Inside of these testable areas, once they're established, we then randomly sample test units and excavate them. Another method is to take a more systematic approach without the random component. Let's go back to our initial research grids. As you will note, test units are spaced out systematically within each grouping. Unfortunately, we run into the problem we had with our basic random sample. There are areas that just won't be testable. Well, we may have an answer to this as well, and I apologize if this is challenging to see the title. It is a stratified systematic sample. As you will quickly note, there is an advantage to stratifying this systematic sample, as we saw with our stratified random sample. In this case, we are able to stratify those areas according to what seems to be valuable or testable, given our research interests. The only thing I would change about this hypothetical example, if I was to incorporate it into my own research, is I would move all of the test units out of the marshy area. It would just be too challenging to test the record in those locations. I may also reduce the number of test units in the heavily forested region. As you can imagine, if you've ever had to dig into soils that were in a forested area, the problems arise when we run into quite a few roots. In this case, I would focus most of my sweat equity on that open grassland environment. It would be the most accessible, and in a sense, it would give us an understanding of what may be occurring in the forested zone or in the marshy area.